Welcome to BWI Live. I'm Thomas Frank Carr. Now, some of you may be thinking, but T. Frank, you said you guys were off this week for spring break. Well, turns out spring break is next week. And somebody got the dates wrong. My mom used to do that all the time. She would say, like, somebody needs to unload the dishwasher. Somebody needs to fold the laundry, like they were. And so I was the youngest of 5 kids, so she was used to saying that, and like there would be 2 or 3 options. But when I was growing up, it was literally just me. And what I'm trying to say is it was me. I got the dates wrong. So we're here this week. We're not here next week. Hi, everybody. Hi, Fitz. Hi, Nate. How you guys doing today? Fitz, what's new in your world?
I really thought you were going to start the show by throwing your mother under the bus, and I was like, we don't deal with that here. That's those are internal issues that you probably should see someone about. But I'm glad you rebounded and made it an anecdote rather than an out-and-out blame, because I know if I blame my mom to top the show on anything, I would hear about it very quickly. So, hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. No, it's great to be here on a Tuesday. Again, spring break next week. For those of you following along the academic calendar, I won't be on the show. So, T. Frank, I think nobody's going to be on the show, right? Worth reiterating.
Yes, next week we are taking spring break off. So,
very good.
Seemed like a good time when everyone was busy anyway. Nate?
Yeah.
What's new?
When I was 7 years old, I was climbing a tree outside of the church that we went to, and my mom left church, and then I watched my dad leave church. Right, so the one car left, and then the next car left, and I haven't gotten over it. My parents left me at church as a 7-year-old.
They came separately. Everyone assumed they had Nate. The other one had Nate, and nobody had Nate.
I literally was in the road just running like, please stop. There were these very friendly people who picked me up and drove me home.
I really, really wish I could have seen that. That was
I mean, it remains a point of contention. I mean, no Thanksgiving goes by without bringing up the scar tissue that I continue, that burden that I weigh.
So I know I look like it, but this is not a therapy session for us. We are going to talk about football today, believe it or not.
What?
And everyone's favorite conversation, not only Penn State wide receivers, but Tyseer Denmark. Nate got a chance to talk to him, wrote a great article about it that everyone is talking about over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Lots of receiver conversation coming up today, so don't worry, we'll be getting to all the good and the bad, but I wanted to start with this one because first off, go to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, sign up for $1. You get to try us out for a week, and you can read the article for yourself. But Nate's going to talk a little bit about what he wrote, a little bit of the conversation, the context with Tyseer Denmark here to start the show. So, first week's $1, then you can join us for a full year, but try us out right now. BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, spring football just around the corner, all kinds of great stuff. So, Nate, Tyseer Denmark, what did you learn?
That's a great question. Look, I don't think that any of these things are guarantees, right? You talk to people outside, right? Most teammates are going to talk nicely about their other teammates, and most coaches are going to speak nicely and complimentary of their players. But I did think that there is an important conversation to have kind of regarding his toughness on the field. It's a word that kind of should be a siren when Penn State fans hear it, when James Franklin talks about, specifically brings up that word toughness, just because of the absence of it in Penn State's receivers room previously. I think that there's a reality to that existed with some of the guys who aren't at Penn State now. Yeah. Right. And so there's a contrast there of, hey, we'll see on some of the other stuff, right? He caught a touchdown to end his regular season. He didn't play a ton. He played in 3 games. I think he had 2 catches. One of them was a touchdown to finish the season. Okay, that may not have been what people had hoped for him going into the season. It may not have been what he hoped for himself, but I do think behind the scenes and kind of what happened in practice through the course of the regular season is a guy who flashed enough with teammates and coaches to say, but okay, there's something to work with here. And specifically that element of is a guy who has the characteristic of fighting for and winning contested balls, because that has been an issue at Penn State, not just this past season, but for the last couple.
We've talked about the fact that talent was not the issue. There was something else holding those players back. And I just think it's interesting because I was in my head, I was racking up the next question of physical or mental toughness. But Fitz, I don't think there's a difference. Like, you have to have mental toughness to be physically tough, I imagine. And so it's just an interesting conversation about that particular position, which, if you were to point to any position in football where you could get away with being a little less tough, maybe it's receiver. And again, that is kind of an insult to the receivers that go out and do the dirty work of blocking and running over the middle and catching the football. But I think that kind of describes where Penn State has been recently and where they're trying to be as a group going forward based on what Nate says. Is that fair? And have you noticed anything in maybe some of these younger receivers that points in that direction around this Tyseer Denmark conversation?
There's a difference in physicality and toughness. Like, Nate is talking about something that's not like going out and Chris Godwining someone, just fighting through somebody and getting the catch. It's maybe more on the mental side. And I think that's kind of what we lose sight of. We kind of flip-flop the script when we're talking about Tyseer Denmark, because you can see the talent, you can see the fluidity, you can see the things that he did so well in high school and all the highlight tapes that he put out of training and everything like that. Like, there's genuine talent there. But unlike the guys that they brought in prior to that, like, the physical side is what needed to come along. And we talk about this usually with linemen more, like using that redshirt year to get faster, to get bigger, to get more ready for the rigors of this level of football. And Tyseer didn't have it last year. And that's something we reported last summer. And I think we just put the blinders on because we didn't want to believe it. But at the same time, it came to fruition in the playing time and in the, the lack of targets and things like that. So I sort of rode that train all through the fall, in the sense that he's going to be a part of the rotation this year. 2025 was the year to circle for a quote unquote immediate impact. And I think that he will spend more time with Chuck Losey. He will spend more time with the strength and conditioning staff, which is phenomenal. They do a phenomenal job. It's just kind of the opposite of what we saw with Amari Evans, what we saw with Tyler Johnson, Caden Saunders. So those guys, fast guys, tremendous physical capabilities, maybe not the sharpest receiver skills. And I think you just kind of flip-flop it with Tyseer. You're just going to need a little bit more time. I mean, why did Omari get on the field as a true freshman? Because he run by everybody. Like, that is kind of it. Tyseer couldn't do that. Tyseer was a 4.6 guy maybe coming in. So you've got the ability to get stronger, faster, and continue to add the proper size to get where you need to be. And I think he'll be fine. Like, that's the kind of thing, in Nate's conversation with him, I think a lot of it's going to revolve around the toughness aspect of it, but a lot of it can also revolve around the patience aspect of it. Like, I think probably going from where he went, which was committed to Oregon, with Ohio State as a finalist, Penn State as a finalist, that is a lofty bar for any receiver really in the country, but like in Penn State's wheelhouse, that actually ends up at Penn State. So you expect him to go right away. That wasn't the case, and that wasn't going to be the case. And that was tough to swallow there. So I'm excited to see what he can do this spring. I'm also excited. Marcus Hagan's just put out his workout of the day. It was Peter Gonzalez. I thought that was very interesting, because Peter, has worked his way back from injury now twice, and hopefully he can, turn that corner. I don't know how much we'll see in the spring, but hopefully he can turn that corner and be a guy that they can eventually rely on. But it's kind of where we're at with the receiver room, is placing the hope in that group instead of that 2022 group, which has flamed out for the most part. Yeah.
Eggman says here in the chat, very hopeful about Peter Gonzalez. Me too. I think there's been, some, I'd say, I don't know the level of realistic hope that Peter could be part of spring football. And Fitz, you've kind of like put it up in the air, and I similar things in terms of understanding where he is on that trajectory. But having him back would be great for him as well for spring football, and getting some of that, because he's in the opposite situation. If he came in with all the physical tools, but need to learn the position, need to be a better wide receiver overall, and actually getting practice time would be great for a guy like Peter. Nate, were there other details and kind of conversational points from Tyseer Denmark that you wanted to go over?
Yeah, I mean, I just think to build on Fitz's point, I think that Caden is a pretty one-to-one comparison in some ways, in that is not going to blow you away with his speed, right? And this is a conversation on pause because we don't know what Caden would have been or would have done this past season had he been healthy, had he been able to play through it. But that, right, kind of the knock on Caden prior to this year, what was that toughness, right?
Yeah.
Like that, whatever that intangible is if you're not this, right, which is KJ Hamler fast, right? You can deal with certain knocks against your game if you are elite at something else.
I think sorry, not to jump in, but this conversation always kind of rubs me because, like, KJ Hamler fast is special fast. Like, that is a level of fast that not everybody, can even comprehend. His ability to generate space that way. So Caden being like runs in the 4.4s, I imagine, is not slow. It's fast enough. It's just, but as you pointed out, and I think that's the context we absolutely have to have with this, is you can't just be fast enough if you don't bring the other things to the table. And that's been the conversation. That's been the real issue. Not that he's slow, because everyone was comparing him to KJ, and most people are going to fall short of that athletic spectrum.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry. I just want to get in here real quick because Deshaun Hamilton was a tough receiver. He wasn't a physical receiver. He wasn't a fast receiver, but the toughness that we're talking about is more along those lines, I think, just in terms of where you want to see that skill set come through. Yeah. Like, and he was a great athlete, but at the same time, like, he wasn't Godwin. He wasn't Hamler. He wasn't that fast guy, but that's the sort of toughness that you're kind of looking for here.
It's always... It's funny to me from the outside looking in, because I do think that there's an element of it that's just not describable. You can't really quite put your finger on it, other than to say, how many times are you going to watch this kid, whoever it is, and say, oh, that dude's a dog. Like that guy is like just whatever that means, but fighting through something, right? It's a it when you see it type of baseline of definition, but I do think that that's an element that Penn State is just very much in need of and searching for, and hopeful that it gets out of that group in some fashion this season, and maybe Tyseer is a guy who can start to bring a little bit of that to that group this year.
I love the nuance of the conversation, because it's like when you talk about toughness, there is a certain comparison to athleticism, where what does that mean? It means so many different things that it means nothing. And so, like, being more specific about these things absolutely brings the context of the situation. And that's what we do here on the BWI Live Show. We give you kind of the full meal instead of just the cotton candy conversation about football and Penn State football. But we do have fun with certain things like beer. Nate, tell me about Antifragile. Tell me about John's. And they got a new type of cheesesteak. Is that what I heard?
It was a mailbag question, wasn't it?
It's that one didn't make it because I knew we were going to talk about it today here.
You know what the crazy thing is I didn't know we were going to talk about this, but I saw it on my Instagram, like, reels. Was a kid eating, it's a breakfast cheesesteak, right? It's egg and bacon and stuff. And he said it was great. So I believe it. The other stuff is great. The cheesesteak is great. The beer is great. So yeah, this is Antifragile Brewing Company. It is downtown. It's on Calder Way. There is plenty of parking. Stop complaining about parking. It's everywhere downtown. And if you do park, you can walk your way. You can walk your way into Antifragile and have the best beer in State College, the best service in State College, the best atmosphere at State College. We cannot say enough about it. They have been a very loyal, advertiser with us and sponsor of this show, and we are grateful for that. So check it out.
Yeah, Eggman with the actual transition I should have used. Eggman says toughness is being anti-fragile. That's exactly resiliency is exactly the right way to do that.
I'll jump in with my pitch here. I had a buddy in town this weekend who actually listens to the podcast, and he's like, "You brainwashed me. I need to go get a cheesesteak." And unfortunately, the timing didn't work, so he came in for breakfast instead. And after breakfast, we drove downtown on Saturday, and town was just buzzing. The State Patty's Day was this weekend, and people were already out celebrating. That's a long Saturday for you kids. I'm very fully 40 years old now as I'm saying that stuff. But we drove by. He wanted to see where Antifragile was because he's from out of town. And we drove by, and it was like 10:30, 10:45, and there was a line for those breakfast cheesesteaks because they look awesome. And like 4 people sent me that reel this weekend as well. So definitely check it out. It is worth the wait, and worth going inside, grabbing a beer, grabbing a cocktail, grabbing kombucha if that's your particular flavor. But we love them. I think they love us, and it's been a great partnership. And hopefully we've brainwashed more people into going and checking it out.
That's right.
Yeah, let them know.
They do have juice boxes for the kids too, in case you are.
That is our demographic here.
If you're wondering, if I
kids.
took my kids, yes, I have.
Well, and I dropped in last weekend when you had your kids there. Your kids were perfectly fine. Your wife was doing all the work anyway.
They're terrible.
And on the second thing here, I haven't complained about parking in months. Like you got to let this one go.
No, I won't.
Okay, great.
I will complain about parking all the time if I want. So some stuff from last week we didn't get to with you guys specifically, and I always appreciate your perspective on these things. Trace McSorley joining the staff for Penn State Football, returning as an assistant quarterback coach. We talked about this with Landon, a special guest on the Wednesday show here from BWI Live, but I wanted to get your perspective. Fitz, I asked the question of, you can't, kind of like the toughness conversation, you can't just like infuse Drew Aller with moxie because Trace McSorley's standing next to him. So I guess that is, what do you think Trace McSorley brings to the staff, and what is this? What is the outlook of what he is going to tangibly perform for the Nittany Lions here in 2025?
Well, he's seen it all, right? I mean, he saw it in the college game. He's been around the pros. He was around the team last fall, but I think he got a call late in the season to go back and play pro football. So that's a pretty appealing call to get. So he's got all that experience. He's worked with some tremendous quarterback coaches. He's been around some awesome quarterbacks, like all different kinds of awesome quarterbacks. And I think that, just that kind of wealth of experience just kind of rubs off on people. And Drew, for all the great things he does, could learn a lot about McSorley, about just being loose, like being the guy that can sort of roll with the punches and go with it, because we've seen him deal with short-term criticism and letdowns and things like that, and it hasn't been great in terms of bouncing back. There have been times when he has been resilient. He has done some great things. USC comes to mind immediately, but you can soak in that stuff. I don't know if you can teach it. I don't know if you can learn it, but you can soak in some of that stuff. And with Trace clearly on the path to being a successful coach, I think he's been that way since he was a player. It's a great start, and coupling him with Danny O'Brien, you get some of the older names in the offensive room. James Urban's in there, who obviously knows Trace as well. So like, you've got a lot of things going for Drew in a year that you need to be all in on Drew. So I think it's a cool little experience. I'm curious to see which direction it goes for him in the next decade, because I think he can be very, very successful at this. But yeah, I think there's sort of learning by osmosis, and I think that's what you're going to see with Drew and with Trace and Drew.
Nate, you wrote about this last week from kind of the program perspective of the decision to hire Trace McSorley. What was your thought on this news and this situation?
I see it as a wave of winners that are coming into the program, which it seems under the radar, but I think, like Fitz said, it rubs off. It permeates it. Right. These are people who have had success at the highest levels. Look, Danny O'Brien is the quarterback's coach.
Yeah.
And is like, he's the guy. So I think that there's maybe been a little bit of confusion's not the right word, but just, okay. Now, like, Trace isn't that guy, but he can help. He's a voice. He's an extra set of eyes. He's a guy who I do think that his age helps. He's not 30 yet, right? He has like relevant, direct institutional knowledge comparisons. Right? Right. Is the guy who lived it, who right? I mean, he stopped playing. His last year at Penn State was in 2018. So I guess in Drew Aller years, that's a long time ago, but in real, like, that's not that long ago. And so I think when you can bring that experience to the table, when you can have those conversations, when you're just around it, I think it helps. I do think that Drew gets right moxie and the intangibles, and right, all that stuff, and it's like a knock against him. I think he's got plenty of it. I think he's made plenty of throws in his career, and specifically this past year, that were
it's
on
just
the money
the
in the right times.
It's
for
just
sure.
the consistency of it, and comparative to the moment, I think also is a fair conversation to have.
I think a second fair conversation to have, especially now that they're gone and it's easier to talk about it, is the ways that his receivers let him down in those specific moments. Yeah. Right? Like because we can talk about this all day, and Drew is the guy, the trigger man, who is going to get knocked for it. Fine. But there is nobody internally, nobody even externally, who knows football, who isn't saying after some of those plays, hey man, like, your receiver's not supposed to let that happen. That isn't something that the receiver...
You have to be inside the defensive back on that play. You have to be beyond the defensive back on that play. You can't let the defensive back take the ball from you on that play. Yeah.
It is just not a game of isolation, and we love it to fit into that neat, tidy box, but it's not. And so can you say, yeah, Drew shouldn't have made that play, or Drew shouldn't have made that throw? Sure. Plenty of times. But also you can say wholeheartedly, yeah, this is a guy who like actually did it with very little of the type of rescuing and help that you need on the other end of that equation outside of Tyler Warren. Really,
I think it's fair to point out that the conversations we've had about Trace McSorley, the conversations about the receivers that we pointed to in Penn State history that are kind of the benchmark, played with Trace McSorley. So like his career is,
and they made those catches. Yeah,
they made those catches. Chris Godwin, give him a chance to catch football, and he's going to make it. Jahan Dotson, I'm sorry, KJ Hamler. Wow. Total buffer there.
You got Hamilton, you got Blacknell, you've got Mike Gesicki. I mean,
thank you.
It's kind of a wash in tight end. Well, maybe not even, but Tyler Warren made those catches, but he's one guy. So like my question here is, he wasn't looking over his shoulder last year, but he was looking to the sideline to see when Bo Prabula would come into the game. And that, of course, sometimes it worked, sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, it throws a funk into everything. And I'm very curious to see, he's going to get 100% of the snaps that matter next year. Like that to me, I like, there's no, like James talked about the Grunk package in SMU. There's no different offense for Ethan Grunkmeyer like there was for Bo Prabula. So I'm very curious to see the fluidity of it all and how he can handle just going snap to snap and not dealing with, the highs of that, like the admitted highs of that package, and then the lows of it not working sometimes. So I'm very curious to see how that's going to, that flow is going to happen with Drew next year.
Last thing here before we get to Fitz's recruiting update, Dan Connor officially named the linebackers coach. A lot of this happens. Fitz, you look fake shocked. What does it mean? I would say, to have the interesting conversation in my mind, what does it mean for Jim Knowles? Obviously, we'll start with Dan Connor is the linebackers coach. That's a big thing for Penn State football fans, but I also think it signals a lot of different things structurally and also in college football in general. So just where do you think the important conversation lies in all of that?
I think the important conversation first with recruiting. Like, I think you look at what Penn State did for Danny O'Brien last spring, maybe last spring, this time last year, I think it was, where they switched him to quarterback coach while he was still a graduate assistant. Like they made him, they put it out there, he got business cards made up quarterback coach, that is the thing that they tried to pronounce to everyone, that he was the quarterback's coach, even though he was a grad assistant. And then he got moved to an analyst, and it was all crazy because all the accountable coaches rules started to pass, and now all of a sudden you just view him as a quarterback coach. Well, that was Dan Connor too, as linebackers. But the reason they did that is so that he could go out and recruit as the quarterback's coach, not necessarily like be the guy that's pounding the pavement and seeing everybody throw, and then eventually did that this fall. But he was the guy that would strike up the relationship with the quarterbacks, did it with Troy Hune, did it with Beckham Kritza, and is doing it with Peter Borek in 2027, among several other quarterbacks who are going to visit this spring. Ryan Snyder had an update on that yesterday. But like, this is the sort of the comfort zone for, if you're going to go play quarterback somewhere, you don't want to play for a graduate assistant. You want to play for a quarterback's coach. Well, if you're going to go play linebacker somewhere, you want to play for a linebacker's coach. And Dan Connor's been that guy. And that's an easy conversation to have if you're in the moment with the recruiting, but it's also an easy conversation to pick apart if you're recruiting against Penn State. So they're going to say, oh, this is not a true linebacker's coach. This guy is just an analyst. Like, he's just hanging out and doing all these things. And I'm not saying it works, but it's definitely possible for that conversation to take place. So with Dan Connor, first and foremost, be the guy and like be the head coach of the linebackers, be the guy that recruits them, be the guy that coaches them up, be the guy that makes the calls and puts them in the game. Like, I think that is the key thing here. And during the D coordinator search, everybody said they need to promote him. Like, he's doing the same thing. I don't know if his payroll changed, but he's doing the same thing, and he's a brilliant guy. So that's number one, is the recruiting aspect of it. Number two, gives Jim Knowles an opportunity to float. I mean, We talk about it with Andy because people lump the offensive coordinator and quarterbacks together. He's not a quarterbacks guy. He's an offensive line background. Well, Jim Knowles has backgrounds at different spots, and it's not just like you're not just coming in to run the linebackers. So he'll be able to float to safeties. He'll be able to get his hybrid guys in their specific spots, work with the D line if he needs to. You can trust Dan Connor to run everything. Like they did it last year. It worked pretty well. And you've got a room that trusts him right now. So I think that's where I go with that, is you turn Knowles into one of those hybrids that we keep talking about. Is he going to coach linebackers? Yes. He's going to coach D-backs? Yes. He's going to be all over the place. So I think that gives you a little bit more flexibility in your coaching staff, which we see moving forward is the ticket, because they've now got assistant running backs coaches and assistant receivers coaches and assistant linebackers, safety, whatever it may be. So that's just the direction I keep going, is like you get a little bit more time to breathe, a little bit more space to work if you're Jim Knowles.
Speaking of Jim Knowles and that hybrid conversation, wrote about that yesterday at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. I've got the second part of that coming up today. Really, I don't usually feel great about the stuff I write in these situations. I feel really good about this one. So if you go check it out, appreciate you doing that, because I think it will inform what Fitz just talked about there from that hybrid player position and the choices Penn State has to make in spring football over the next couple of weeks. P. Danny says, hit that like button, everyone. Feed the almighty algorithm. Man, I started off hot. A couple false starts here. I'll get it right. Nate, final thoughts here from you, because we're not going to hear from you for about 10 minutes when we get into Fitz's recruiting update. So last word here before we get to that. What do you got?
Everybody really likes Dan Connor.
Yes.
That's a great place to end. We're going to get into Fitz's recruiting update, talk more about linebacker recruiting. Maybe. I don't know. Spring football recruiting, I don't know the exact timeline, Fitz, and that's what you're here to tell us about in terms of when players are coming to visit now that we're in March. But of course, Penn State starts spring practice on the 25th. There's some gray area there, but the big news this weekend, Jaquaden Guilford decommitting from the program. Tell us about that situation and how you view this news.
Yeah, Friday night at 7:00. Great time for that. Jaquaden Guilford, a guy that I'm very high on, still high on, by the way, even though he decommitted from Penn State. I think he's a really good player. I think he's a really good athlete, and Penn State would like to get him back in the fold. And I think they've got an opportunity to. Obviously, when you decommit from somewhere, it doesn't really, usually come back around. But I think Penn State will still be in this one. Sting factor, decently high. This is a really good receiver, really good potential receiver. I think he's probably a guy, maybe not a freshman impact type guy, but he's got all the tools. He's got the size. He's one of those physically tough receivers that we've talked about that has eluded Penn State for some time now. So I think it's pretty stingy. You look at what Penn State's doing at receiver. They still got, Jasir Rogers and LeVar Keys in the fold, and they're going to continue to press at guys like Messiah Hampton, Travis Johnson in Virginia, Connor Salmon in Virginia, Well, I guess he's in Maryland now at the Bullis School. Davion Brown in Virginia, and then they've got some national guys that are going to come out and visit in the spring and summer. So still have options out there. It helps that it helps that there is a couple of guys in the barn already, so to speak. So it doesn't really change my feelings on the class as a whole. Although, he's a guy that they'd like to have back. Like he's a really, really good player. So he tweeted a bunch of offers last night, Michigan, Purdue, Kentucky, several offers, but very curious to see which direction this one goes. This is an interesting one. I'm going to probably write a little bit about it later on the site at BlueWireIllustrated.com, but he's definitely a sting for Penn State. And I don't think it's a situation where he's going to turn around and commit anywhere right away. I think he's going to continue to assert his options and take a look at what's out there. So that's a tough one for Penn State, because that was one that they really liked and he really liked them, and jumped on board in December and out of the class by, I guess that was the end of February. So not a great stop.
So I'm going to put this up here on the screen here for the YouTube audience, because I just want to paint the picture of the differences between what Fitz and I are talking about. Both of us really like Quay Guilford in terms of his talent, his potential, and where he is right now. 3-star and 88 overall in the latest On 300 update. I don't know why. Maybe a little bit of a body catcher, maybe a little bit of a potential over production. I hadn't fully gotten into his full game tape, but the highlights were enough to get me very excited.
It's also March, so right. And he's north of the whatever parallel separates the South from the North. Like, a lot of these movements that we see in February are going to be guys that are working out in the South and doing the camps and things like that. So I think that, and I said this on the board at BlueWireIllustrated.com, like, when you will see more changes in the Northeast and I guess Midwest as the weather gets warmer, as more guys are being able to be seen. And, I think that he's a 4-star guy. I think he's a really, really talented player.
To that point, Penn State, Ohio State, Tennessee, Miami, Georgia, Kansas, Michigan, Toledo in here, really important offer. There's just a ton. There's just Notre Dame, Alabama are interested. I think there's not official offers here, but the list here is going to grow, in my opinion, as well. Because do you see him eventually becoming a national prospect? Is he already a national prospect, and like he committed before he realized that? Is that part of the conversation here?
No, I think he's a semi-regional guy. Like, there's a lot of really good receivers out there. Like they are, like, I don't think Notre Dame has offered, but if Jaywan Sider's there, he saw what he saw at Penn State. Maybe Jaywan goes after a guy that he knows or thinks can play. So I think he'll be past that regional recruit, but short of the national scene, if that makes sense. I know he's got the Ohio State offer. He earned it at camp, which is pretty cool. Earned his Penn State offer at camp as well. But I think he'll be a guy that's on the upper end of the regional, lower end of the national type guy. Like, I think he's really good. But it's so tough with receiver, because everywhere you go, there's talent. Like we think there's talent. Like, everywhere you go, there are big fish that look like Quay Guilford in the South and Southwest and California and just all over the place. So I don't know how to quantify it, but I think he'll be in the mix. But I mean, if you're on that fringe 4-star spot, like, you're probably a pretty good player. So I think you characterize it perfectly of saying Penn State is still in this, but of course there's, that's that elevation of maybe not fully national, but a guy that is going to command a lot of attention, and I assume a lot of NIL dollars, which is part of. Part of this conversation. NIL not a factor right now.
Okay, got it.
When you come back into it, you all of a sudden sort of put yourself back out there. So you saw him tweet out those offers last night: Michigan, Purdue, Kentucky. There was a few more in there. So all of a sudden it's like you have an opportunity as a school to get back in and say, well, we weren't recruiting you because you were committed. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter, because you can say you're committed. We didn't want to waste your time. We didn't want to waste our time. But now that you're back on the market, we've always really liked you, and we just want to be in the mix the next time around. So official visit is going to be very important. Where he sets him up, how he sort of handles the next couple of months, because it's going to come at him pretty fast over the next couple of weeks. So I'm curious to see where that stands and where he ends up visiting in March and maybe April.
Just one last thing: 6'2", 180, great frame. I like his potential a lot. Those guys don't come around. The way he runs, all that stuff, I think is part of this conversation. But to put that down and talk about some of the other things, of course, read more BlueWhiteIllustrated.com because Fitz just said he's going to write more about that in the coming hours or day. What else is going on with recruiting that you think is important to highlight here? And of course, for people that want more, we'll have our full recruiting show on Thursday. But what's coming out this weekend do you think is important to discuss?
So I read calendars. I don't know if you've tried this or not, but next week is spring break.
Buddy, I have a calendar full of things, but I have extreme ADHD. So, like, it doesn't matter. I try my best.
So what happens typically is Penn State will get a week and then have spring break and then come back on the next week, usually the 18th, and start spring practice. Well, that's not going to happen because blue-white game got pushed back, or spring football weekend got pushed back, and now all of a sudden you've got another week in there. So no visitors this week, no visitors next week, and then you sort of get into the swing of things with maybe a couple of guys that are lingering around spring break. You always get those guys that come in and visit Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, Notre Dame. Like those are the spring break trips that guys come up from the South and check it out. So maybe the third week of March, and then the real visits will start at the end of March. So suffice to say that you're wasting a bit of time, but you're using the time that you have. Like it's not useful to host somebody on spring break, and a lot of those coaches are out here anyway. It's not going to happen much until that last weekend that last week of March. Ryan Snyder's been all over it, just sort of confirming guys left and right here. But it's going to take some patience to get there.
All right. And, I think James Franklin has talked about it before. Even if like it's a dead period or you're on vacation, if a player calls or a player wants to visit, you're not going to say no, most likely, because you want to make sure you make a good impression. That's got to be exhausting. Anything else here? I didn't want to put words in your mouth on the rundown. What else did you want to talk about here, if anything else? And we can get to that.
You got Beckham Kritze here on the rundown. Wrote about him yesterday. I think it's a very interesting situation, Penn State's quarterback room, because it is so distinct in terms of tiers, because you've got Drew as the starter. You've got the two guys battling for the backup spot, Ethan Grunkmeyer and Jackson Smolik. Smolik was the workout guy of the day. I think that you've got a gap there, and then you've got Beckham Kritze, who's going to be, as we expected, a long-term project. He came onto campus. He's south of 200 pounds, and if you see him, he's close to 6'6". I mean, he is a stork in every sense of the word. Like, he is a long and lean guy who's going to need to get stronger, but he's thrown the ball pretty well since he's gotten here. But again, this is going to be one that is a 3-year project, I think. Is the patience there to stick around? His high school transfer situation kind of sticks in the back of your mind. And I think that that's a very interesting way to follow it. But I've written a couple of these early enrollee profiles so far, and the profile is a tough word because I try to work actual intel into them. And it's just it's an interesting balance because you look at some of the guys that came in January, and some of them have an opportunity to make some ripples in the spring. Kritze probably not one of them, but Andrew Olish, Matthew Otten, wrote about Darius Dixon a week or two ago. So you've got an opportunity for those guys to come in and maybe do something. I'm very curious to see, and I don't know if it'll matter or not, but a bunch of those guys came in for not bowl practice, but college football playoff practice. That's an incredible step to make, because you come in, not so much the physical aspect of it, not so much the speed of the game or anything like that, but just to get into practice. When you go from high school football to college football, the practice schedule, the regimen that you go through, not just the 2 hours that you're at practice, but the hour before in the training room and all the stuff that you do afterwards. And then you actually film practice and watch practice. Like, all that stuff is a head rush, man. Like, there's a lot being thrown at you very, very quickly. Now, did they get the full experience? Probably not, because Penn State was worried about playing SMU, I guess not SMU, but Boise and Notre Dame. But you get an idea of what the structure is. And I think that that's going to help those guys when they get there. We've seen, you remember Nate Bruce a couple of years ago. He got into practice in the spring. I think he lasted 2 practices, and that was it. Like, a lot of that stuff is tough that wave just kind of crashes on you right away. And how you respond kind of dictates how the rest of your spring might go. So I'm very curious to see how these guys that arrived early, that got into the mix, that got their physicals done, that did all the physical stuff as high schoolers with college football players. I'm curious to see how that's going to pay off, and I think it can. I don't know that it will, but I think it can.
The part that I think is super interesting is these are also guys who were here, as you mentioned, like in late December. We're not talking about after the winter break or anything like that. They were here during that playoff run, and just those number of days in the weight room is just like, now we're talking about almost a full year that they're at 8-9 months that they're in the Penn State football program to actually physically develop in that first year. And I think that's incredibly valuable. Let's get to more here on the show, but of course, subscribe here to the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel. Please like the video. Always appreciate you doing those things. Now, let's get to my favorite thing, which is we bring Nate on and answer your questions in the BWI Mailbag. Nate is back, and we've got some questions from people at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Of course, the best way to ask a question in the mailbag is, Nate, what are you doing? Well, are you like, well, first off, you're muted, so you could have yawned fully if you wanted to.
I was suppressing a yawn.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to draw attention to it, but I thought you were reacting to something I said. Anyway, let's just get into it. 2 questions here. That are basically the same, same in spirit, but I want to ask them simultaneously because I think they're interesting in terms of how is practice going to go. DS0927, XY, capital exclamation point, new member at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. What will spring practice look like for the team this year from a physicality and intensity standpoint, given how key contributors will get rest during that time frame? On the other side of that, asking a more specific part of that, is Poncho 570. He says, do you foresee the staff having another physical spring practice like last year in order to help accelerate the development of defensive ends and defensive tackles who are young in the program? So spring practice, long season, veteran rest days. Nate, jump right in here. How do you think this is going to play out for Penn State football?
I can't see James Franklin not wanting and employing a very physical spring practice for all the guys. Like, I think that the waves of knowing that older guys who are proven and have nothing to prove are just, they're going to take it easy. That's been the case for a while. But as a guy who is best practice oriented and likes to build on things that work and shed things that don't, if last spring was super physical and they made it to the college football playoff semifinal,
yeah,
probably do it again. Right. I mean, I don't know exactly how that will take shape, but certainly from the standpoint of, look, there's also a secondary component to this of, there were a lot of guys that were banged up through the season and after the season had to have stuff done to get it cleaned up. That's not who we're talking about with spring practice. We're talking about freshmen, sophomores, transfers, that kind of stuff. Like there are plenty of healthy bodies who do have something to prove, who will be, thrown into the fire, I think, a little bit. And I think it will be plenty physical for those guys.
Fitz, let's focus on that defensive line. Liam, everyone wants to know about Liam Andrews. Everyone wants to know about the defensive tackle position.
Who?
Do you think that they will, what's the value of that physicality? What's the value of, making it as close to live as possible for guys like that? Do you see like that does help them develop tangibly as football players, and the benefit of that, could that make them available to contribute at some point next year?
So yes, and you've got to, number one, wrap Zane Durant in bubble wrap and make sure he makes it through the spring all good. But you've got a lot of defensive tackles. Like that's the thing. The numbers aren't an issue. It's the experience and sort of maybe the talent level as well, where you've got a bunch of redshirt freshmen, younger guys like Ty Blanding. So yeah, you want to be hard on those guys. Like you want to be physical because you need to replicate some sort of the physicality that they're going to see when you need them the most. And you go from of course, number one was Zane, but you go down the list and there's guys that haven't played in a game, and you can't replicate game conditions, but at the same time, you can pound on those guys and make sure they understand what they're getting into. So you kind of figure that stuff out as you go. 15 practices, maybe not enough to make that happen. I think we're going to still see a logjam at some point coming out of spring with the defensive tackles. But you've got guys like Liam Andrews, who we don't know what he can do. And we don't know how hard Penn State's going to push on him, because all of a sudden you start from zero like that. If you have to restart, that's not great. DeAndre Cook is an interesting guy, but you've got intriguing options. Owen Wafel, I think, is a very interesting one to me. I think we're going to see a lot of him this spring, and not necessarily going to signify that we're going to see a lot of him this fall. Like, because you got to get those guys reps, you got to get those guys experience, and you've got the opportunity to do so over a month. So yes, and they can pound on those guys, but at the same time, I don't know how much finality you're going to get out of that in terms of the rotation that's going to pop up in the fall.
Am I still available here? Because
yeah, I got
you for a second. Okay, great. Because I don't want to
awkward
repeat
pauses that I was taking was just natural. I was just,
no, they were.
My mouth got ahead of my head, and then, or vice versa. I don't know. And yes, somebody mentioned Gilliam in the chat. He's implied here, like he's going to be right up there as well. So it's funny. You've got a bunch of guys that are redshirt freshmen, sophomores. So like Gilliam is in that Cooper Cousins mold for me, where you don't really think of him as part of that group, even though he is the same eligibility as DeAndre Cook, Liam Andrews, and Owen Wafel. So I think he's sort of not in a tier of ahead of those guys, but expected to be. I mean, if you're drawing up a
head
right now, with Alonzo Ford sideline, if you're drawing up a depth chart right now, which you've done on BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, I've got him beside Zane Durant. I think that's a pretty good spot to be for a redshirt freshman. Absolutely.
CJ Philly with the question of the day, which, I enjoyed making the thumbnail on this one. Crazy to say, for the first time in a while, will Penn State need to lean on the offense more than the defense, with the questions at defensive line that we just outlined? And he throws in linebacker there. Nate, does the Penn State offense need to score points this year and win games in a different way than we're used to in recent memory?
Yes. But
you
also,
think they can do it?
I don't know. We'll see. I think that we talk ourselves into all kinds of things, not conspiratorially, but like, let's just do some simple math here. Drew Aller, Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, the offensive line, and Andy Koldenicki in year 2, right? Yeah. Versus minus Abdul Carter, minus Jaylen Reed, right? And minus Tom Allen. So year 1 for Jim Knowles.
Yeah.
My mental math says, okay, the dynamic is going to have to change, but it always had to change. It had to change last year, got better last year, right? The reality is the Penn State's offense at Southern Cal, I mean, the defense got blitzed in the first half of that game, right? That wasn't a strong performance. USC did whatever they wanted in the first half of that game. So, I think that generally speaking, Penn State, like I don't know how else to say what I say all the time, which is 7 points against Ohio State or no points against Ohio State offensively doesn't cut it. Right? Like, these are the games that we're talking about. Oregon, Penn State's offense did better, but it had a very slow start to that game, right? And the defense had a very slow start to that game. I just think it all works together, and I think that there is a formula for Penn State where the defense doesn't have the gaudiest numbers, right? But is still very strong and very good. And Jim Knowles' touch helps mitigate the losses of who is undeniably a spectacular player in Abdul Carter. You can't replace that.
No,
like he's not on the roster next year. So that's like lacking that is something that you're going to have to make up for. But also, you are counting on the offensive side of the ball with the strengths that it has and the players that it has coming back and the talent that everybody sees there, taking another step and being more consistent and doing the things that it hasn't done against the best defenses in the country. with more consistency. They've showed flashes of it, but just put it all together.
Fitz, it's funny because there were no obvious hiccups in the offense, but I was having a conversation with somebody this offseason, and that's something they brought up of it was year one. And I'm speaking, I think specifically of Drew Aller in terms of he operated the offense so well that I think we don't give him credit for. That was year one in what they were describing as a very complex offense. And even if you do everything you can to simplify the transition, it is a transition to a new offense. Do you think there are just natural things that will happen in year two? I understand the difference in the context of the receivers that he'll be throwing to, but also Drew just being better, because he went from being one of the best at making reads and getting to his second progression in 23 to somebody who production struggled in that area, and his decision-making in that area struggled in 24. And I don't think I credited enough of that transition in the offense last year. Do you think that's a fair point of emphasis to the more explosive passing game?
I think there's elements to that, but I also think that Tyler Warren as a security blanket was the thing last year, and he's a hell of a security blanket to have. I would throw to him as much as I possibly could, like Drew did last year. Khalil Dinkins isn't going to have 200 targets. Luke Reynolds is going to have a bunch of targets. It's not going to be close to what we saw this year. So the usage rate is going to be a little bit more even this year. And I think that's going to help spread things out. I think that's going to help with everything, including the running game, which I think that's got to be your bell cow. That's got to be your thing that gets you through there. And when you look at Penn State's schedule, you need that game 3 times, something like that. Does that make sense? Like if you look at Oregon, that's huge. Ohio State, that's huge. Maybe you can add another one on there, but like that's what it comes down to me. It's like, this is not a team that's going to score 63 points a week. Like this is going to be a team that, all of a sudden has to score at the right times. And Nate, you kind of said that Penn State started slow in the Big Ten championship game against Oregon, but they scored 10 points in the first quarter, which is really good for a Penn State team.
It was the turnovers.
Yeah. The thing that I keep getting back into is like, this offense needs to be able to bounce back when the defense has a lapse. And we've gotten so spoiled by this defense over the last couple of years because the lapses have been few and far between. Penn State did that fairly well in the Big Ten championship game. They've done it at different times during the season. Minnesota, for example, Minnesota scored 19 points in the first half, and they've been able to do that. So that to me is more important than can this offense not carry the defense, but can this offense keep up with the defense? So the ability to be resilient and bounce back and get those scores when they need them is what's been missing against Ohio State, Michigan, and et cetera.
What it feels like at times is they decide when to turn on the faucet of aggression, is how it felt like in the playoffs, where the nature of the offense evolved over time, and they were aggressive to start the year, but then it became like, we're going to lean on the defense and the run game. And then in certain games, Drew, go be a hero. Like now you got to be aggressive, Drew. I just feel like if that is true, you're not allowing him the consistency of knowing how and when to be aggressive. So it's kind of like running the ball and pass protection for an offensive lineman. One is a passive action. The other is an active action. If you talk to linemen, they're like, I love run blocking. I get to dictate the interaction, as opposed to I have to pass block. It's by nature, you're just waiting to get defeated at times. So if you're the quarterback and it's like, well, you're going to be a sidecar for all but 4 games, are you prepared to be aggressive correctly in those moments? And I'm kind of working out a theory that I felt over time, but not really like, there's not evidence all over the place because there are so many different variables of Anthony Donko was injured and you were playing teams where you didn't need to do certain things, or game plan changes week to week. Like the defense says something about what the offense is going to do based on their weaknesses. It's just like there was that sense in year one of James Franklin said, and it will rattle around in my head until the next, important thing he says, that we didn't want to call the game in the playoffs and regret something afterwards. And they came out super aggressive against SMU, against Oregon, against Notre Dame and Boise State. They were aggressive in all those situations. And that was not the case, in November. And part of it is they don't have to be, but you're not practicing that, I guess, is kind of how I feel about if, that is a fair representation of what the dynamic was week to week.
Do you think they can be aggressive over a 12-game schedule plus playoffs? Like, just go out and go sort of balls to the wall, like as an offense, like that's never been James Franklin's sort of MO, and really Andy's either. But like, it's just an interesting dynamic. Like, everybody wants to turn it up all the way, all the time, but I don't think that's really possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I guess it's not necessarily they got to throw the ball 40 times a game, but it is more of how you're incorporating deep shots, how the drop back passing game is involved. Where I'll give you an example of Purdue was specific to the defense they were expecting. But if you're running a bunch of RPOs and you're running a bunch of quick game and you're not actually giving him quality shots outside of third down, I guess it's just the alchemy of the offense of when are those first down passes that are aggressive versus we're going to be aggressive when we have to be, and it's going to be a last resort. Kind of giving Drew Aller the free reign to be aggressive when he needs to be, as opposed to it felt like, okay, the game plan is here and we're going to stay within color in this box. And then in a different game, it's like, well, now the box is bigger. And again, this is all kind of like coming out of me all at once. So I don't want this to be taken as like, there might be some things I'm saying that are totally unfair, and I don't want to go too far down that road when it comes to the basic facts of what the play calls and the decision making were. This is more of a step back and feel that kind of conversation, feel that from the perspective. And when you talk about feel, that's where I'm like, maybe I'm getting a little too much into this particular thought because it's based on feel, not fact. That's all. Talked myself out of it.
You play to win the game.
Right. Okay. We'll move on. We'll move on because I know what you're saying. But I just think that we'll move on.
How do you win the game?
Yes.
Win the game.
Okay. So we only have a couple minutes left here on the show. Are there any questions here that you guys have seen in the chat while I was rambling for about 2 minutes? Because I want to get to everybody in the chat if they got a question. But we have a couple more here. So let's go with this question from M. Waltrip. He says, what's the Achilles heel position this year where one KJ Winston type injury early in the season would cause serious concern with a lack of depth at the position? Nate, do you have a position that comes to mind with injury risk and fragility of depth?
This uplifting topic, yes. Nate, you got that one? Enjoy.
Am I supposed to say anything other than receiver? And that's without knowing what it's going to look like.
I'll go with this one.
If you don't have, like, you need all the bullets. You need every single guy that you have in that. You can't afford to have inhibited options when you don't know which options yet are going to succeed. Right. So if it's hey, throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, you need as much in your hand to throw there, right? Until you figure out what that combination is going to look like. And certainly internally, I'm sure they have a better sense than I do of who those guys are going to be. Though I think that the spring will help that process significantly. I struggle with looking around the roster. Really, well, honestly, quarterback. I think that counts.
Yeah.
Right. Like to that question specifically, quarterback. That would be one. But yeah, no, I don't know. I think receiver is very important that they stay healthy.
I'm going to
fit.
No,
sure.
It's all over the defense. Like I don't think we're giving enough credit to not the lack of depth, but the lack of experience, the lack of proven depth that Penn State has. So, I mean, you lost six bona fide great starters from last year. Now all of a sudden you've got Zakee Wheatley as the one safety, and then everybody else. You've got AJ Harris as the one corner, and then you got everybody else. And I think the corners are talented. I think they'll be fine. You've got Tony Rojas as the one linebacker, and then everyone else. Keon Wiley's a wild card because he's coming off of injury. You got other guys that are in there that you're hopeful are going to be good. You've got Zane Durant as the one defensive tackle with Alonzo Ford hurt, and then everybody else. You got Dennis Sutton, similar situation with Zariah Fisher coming off an injury. Then you got everybody else. So, like, I understand that it's part of college football. It's part of the rebuild, the cycle of college football. But everywhere on defense, there's a legitimate shot that something like that, if that's something like that did happen, they take a huge hit. So
yeah,
I know everybody's happy about Jim Knowles and everything like that, but like the personnel is going to have to sort of sharpen itself pretty good to get back to where it was the last couple of years in terms of depth.
So that'll do it today for the BWI Live Show. I'm Thomas Frank Carr. Sean Fitz leaving us on a good point there.
Great,
we'll be back.
Lovely note. Yeah.
We'll be back tomorrow talking about, I don't know what yet, with Greg Pickle. A lot of great conversation topics over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com we can pick from. Of course, a wrestling show I think is going to be back this week. Don't hold me to that. And of course, we will be off next week for spring break. But we got 2 more shows. We got 2 more hours of conversation this week from Blue White Illustrated. So thank you for sitting with us today. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll talk to you.